2 potential presidents, but only one clear leader in political coverage.
We have more people, we have more equipment, but the story is still what essentially is important. It's the political story.
Follow the leader as we follow the party leaders and focus on the issues that will impact your life. Coming this summer, CNN brings you complete live coverage of the Democratic and Republican national conventions. CNN, follow the leader.
This is CNN, a network of Turner Broadcasting System.
The military are trained and equipped to shoot everybody who comes over the hill. They are not trained and equipped to distinguish the good guys from the bad guys.
Defense Secretary Frank Carlucci says weapons of mass destruction have no place in the war on drugs.
This is CNN Prime News with Bernard Shaw in Washington, Mary Alice Williams in New York, and Lou Waters at CNN Center in Atlanta.
Proponents of military might in the war on drugs began to retreat today. The about-face came at a rare joint hearing of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. While the lawmakers repositioned themselves, the Defense Secretary reinforced his position. CNN's Carl Rochelle reports.
Some of the very same members who had voted to require the military to do more in the fight against drugs were rethinking their actions out loud.
It appears to me, speaking only for myself at this time, we did move a little hasty.
Perhaps we leaped before we looked. And although you're not saying explicitly, I have the feeling that perhaps the members of Congress have been actually stampeded.
Defense Secretary Carlucci remains opposed to a law enforcement role.
The military are trained and equipped to shoot everybody who comes over the hill. They are not trained and equipped to distinguish the good guys from the bad guys.
Support for the Pentagon position was mixed.
Interdict these people, and upon positive identification, shoot these drug-bearing aircraft down and machine gun the survivors.
Any idea that we're going to solve this problem with the military is an absolute sham and fraud.
Perhaps most upset of all was Senator Pete Wilson of California, who authored the original bill.
That vote went 83-6 in the Senate, an overwhelming vote in the House. Now you've got people who were talking very tough, who clearly have buckled to Pentagon pressure.
But Wilson found some unexpected support from the campaign trail.
Let me say, we've not spent the last 200 years defending our country from despots and dictators, only to lose our interest to the drug dealers and the gangs.
The committee was so involved in establishing their positions on the already passed bill that Defense Secretary Carlucci's proposal to require defense contractors to provide a drug-free workplace went almost unnoticed. But if the Pentagon tries to implement that proposal, it is sure to draw almost as much fire as the drug bill. Carl Rochelle, CNN, The Pentagon.
Witnesses tell a House subcommittee of an abrupt halt of a drug investigation at a top-secret Star Wars research center in California. Some members of Congress charged the Department of Energy shut down the undercover investigation, then tried to cover it up. CNN's Greg Lefebvre has more on the story from Livermore, California.
A Michigan congressman says the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories was once a hotbed of drug dealing and using. But he says in 1986, the lab quashed its own undercover drug probe when investigators began closing in on some users who held top-secret so-called Q clearances.
In some cases, government computers and other property were traded for drugs. A number of the arrested employees had security clearances and worked in sensitive areas at the laboratory.
Agents say they had leads on 127 suspect employees.
I frankly was very flabbergasted that just prior to gaining the Q clearance, which would have gained me access into the classified areas, we terminated the operation.
The drugs included cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamines, and barbiturates. About 12,000 people work at the lab east of San Francisco. The probe, called Snowstorm, nabbed 16. They quit or were fired, all from lower security positions.
I would only say that Department of Energy top officials seem to think that just saying no is enough. Operation Snow Job indicates otherwise. It's clear that the department is too afraid of the stigma of drugs to really deal with the problem.
The lab's top brass is furious, saying officers had in fact run out of new leads, and the lab felt the need to make arrests and go public rather than prolong the probe and let the dealers continue to sell.
And instead of giving us credit for that, we're being criticized.
Laboratory officials say the Dingell Committee's investigation has little to do with drugs and much to do with politics. Livermore's associate director says Dingell is often at odds with the nuclear weapons research conducted at the lab.
I believe Dingell is strongly opposed to some of the activities that the Department of Energy has done, and I believe we're just a victim in that struggle between Representative Dingell and the Department of Energy.
A charge Dingell denies. The lab says its high-profile anti-drug campaign, which includes bomb and drug-sniffing dogs, has cut the amount of contraband on base. And they say complaints of drug use have dropped dramatically. Greg LaFave, CNN, Livermore, California.
The House Foreign Affairs Committee today approved a bill that allows withholding aid from countries suspected of involvement in drug trafficking. The measure gives specific authority to the Agency for International Development to withhold economic and military aid. The bill also would require the Secretary of State to revoke the passports of U.S. citizens convicted of violating drug laws.
President Reagan is joining fellow Republicans in saying what he thinks about the ethics investigation into House Speaker Jim Wright, the top Democrat in the House of Representatives. More now from CNN congressional correspondent Pam Olson.
In an interview with reporters, President Reagan says he thinks everyone would feel more comfortable if House Speaker Jim Wright were investigated by an independent counsel rather than the House Ethics Committee. That committee voted last week to conduct a preliminary investigation, but has made no decision whether to seek an outside counsel. Special investigators were hired to investigate charges against executive branch officials, such as Iran-Contra defendants Oliver North and John Poindexter. Attorney General Ed Meese has felt the stinging probe of a special counsel.
Well, I would certainly think the president's request is a very valid one.
But when Congress wrote the Ethics in Government Law in 1978, they exempted themselves. Instead, any allegations of misconduct and wrongdoing are investigated by the Ethics Committee, which is the only House committee comprised of an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, 6 each. The chairman of the committee, however, is California Democrat Julian Dixon. According to Hill staffers, inquiries have been made to about a dozen law firms throughout the country for a possible outside counsel, but no decision to retain one has been made. But pressure on both sides to hire one has been building. Early in the presidential primaries, Democrats made it clear they would campaign against the Republican sleaze factor. Vice President George Bush quickly countered and has made it difficult for Democrats. Wright maintains he's done nothing wrong and says he won't tell the Ethics Committee how to do its business. The Speaker is scheduled to chair the Democratic National Committee in July. If a special counsel is hired, the investigation is not likely to be over by then.
Some Democrats worry that if a special counsel is named, the issue could carry on throughout the summer and into the fall campaign. But Democrats want to avoid charges of a whitewash, which are more likely to occur unless a special counsel is named. Pam Olson, CNN, Capitol Hill.